The wind kicked up dust across the empty Wyoming plain as Sarah clutched her white wedding bouquet with trembling hands. She stood alone on the porch of the old boarding house, watching the stranger approach on horseback. His dark silhouette cut against the fading sunset like a knife through silk. For 3 years, Sarah had lived in isolation with her aging father, never stepping foot beyond the ranch boundaries. She had never held a man's hand. She had never been kissed. And now, a marriage arranged by distant relatives would change everything. The man dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the wooden boards with a heavy thud. His name was Jack Mercer, and he was known throughout the territory as the loneliest man alive. Rumors painted him as dangerous, heartless, and untouched by human connection. He had lived in the mountains for 15 years, speaking to no one, trusting no one. The marriage was his choice, made with the same detached practicality he applied to everything else in life. He needed someone to maintain his household. She needed escape from her confined existence. It seemed simple enough on paper. "You look scared," Jack said, his voice rough like gravel underfoot. He studied her with eyes the color of storm clouds, eyes that had seen more pain than any human should endure. Sarah could not meet his gaze. She nodded slightly, her fingers working the bouquet until petals fell to the ground. "I've never done this before," she whispered, though she wasn't certain what this meant. Marriage? Speaking to a stranger? Beginning a new life? All of these things terrified her equally. Jack removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature gray. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 40, with lines etched deep into his weathered face. These weren't laugh lines. These were lines carved by solitude and sorrow. The ceremony took place in the small wooden church at sundown. The preacher spoke quickly, eager to finish before darkness fell completely. No family attended. No friends gathered. The witness was a stranger Jack had hired from town, a man who fell asleep during the vows. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, only the wind answered, howling through the broken church windows like a ghost's complaint. After the ceremony, Jack drove Sarah in his wagon up the mountain road toward his cabin. The journey took 4 hours, climbing higher into terrain that grew increasingly wild and untamed. Sarah watched the last traces of civilization disappear behind her. She was now Mrs. Jack Mercer, married to a man she had spoken to for less than an hour. As darkness surrounded them completely, she felt the weight of her decision pressing down like a physical force. There was no going back now. The ranch, the familiar rooms of her childhood, her father's presence, all of it was gone forever. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, a structure of dark wood that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. Candlelight flickered in the windows, a single warm glow against the vast emptiness. Jack lifted Sarah from the wagon, and she noticed how carefully he held her, as though she might break. Neither of them spoke as he led her inside. The cabin was simple but immaculate. A fire burned in the stone fireplace. 2 plates sat on the table with food that had been prepared in advance. On the mantel, Sarah saw faded photographs of people she would later learn were Jack's family, all dead now, all gone decades before. Jack showed her to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. Clean sheets covered a narrow bed. A window looked out onto nothing but darkness and night sky. "You rest," he said, and something in his voice suggested he understood her fear completely. He understood it because he had lived in his own kind of fear for 15 years. As he closed the door softly behind him, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Tomorrow would bring questions that tonight could not answer. Tomorrow would demand courage she was not certain she possessed. But tonight, she was alone with her thoughts, her racing heart, and the knowledge that nothing in her life would ever be simple again. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of Jack moving around the cabin. She could hear him stoking the fire, then water running into pots. The sounds were ordinary, domestic, almost comforting in their rhythm and purpose. For the first time since arriving, she wondered about his life before marriage, before this mountain, before 15 years of solitude. What had transformed a man into such a fortress of silence and restraint? She dressed carefully in one of the plain dresses she had brought with her. The wedding dress hung in the wardrobe like a ghost of yesterday, white and pristine and belonging to another woman, another time. When she emerged into the main room, Jack had already prepared breakfast. Fresh eggs, bread, coffee, berries in a wooden bowl. He had even placed a small vase with wildflowers in the center of the table. The gesture was so at odds with his hard exterior that Sarah almost didn't recognize it as kindness. "Thank you," she said softly, sitting across from him. Jack was already eating, his movements efficient and practiced. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he poured her coffee and pushed a small pitcher of cream toward her. "I'll show you around today," he finally said. So you understand how things work here? It was not a question. Sarah nodded, sensing that understanding the practical mechanics of survival would somehow make this new reality feel less overwhelming. She ate quickly, her hunger surprising her, and then followed Jack out into the cool mountain morning. The property was larger than it appeared from the road. Beyond the cabin lay a barn, a chicken house, a small garden protected by deer fencing, and a storage shed filled with supplies prepared for winter. Every task was explained in simple terms. This was how you collected eggs. This was how you stored vegetables in the underground cellar to prevent freezing. This was the well, and yes, the water was cold enough to make your hands ache within minutes. Jack demonstrated everything without condescension or impatience, as though teaching a child the basics of living. By noon, Sarah's feet ached, but her mind felt clearer. There was comfort in understanding how things functioned, in knowing what was expected. The physical world, at least, operated according to logical rules. It was the emotional world that remained a mystery, vast and unmapped as the wilderness surrounding them. That night, Sarah helped prepare dinner. Jack showed her his small library of books, volumes about animals, plants, geology, and history. Few were about people or emotions. When she opened one to read by the firelight, Jack watched her from across the room. She felt his gaze like a weight, curious but not intrusive. "You're not what I expected," he said after a long silence. Sarah looked up from her book, waiting for him to continue. "I thought you'd be angry. Or desperate to leave. Most people would be." She turned this observation over in her mind, understanding that he was trying, in his clumsy way, to communicate. He was trying to bridge the gap between two strangers. "I don't know what else to feel," Sarah admitted. "Yesterday, my life was here," she gestured vaguely toward the direction of the ranch. "Now it's here. I can't change the choice I already made, so I'm trying to make peace with it." Jack nodded slowly, as though this explanation satisfied some question he had been carrying for years. He stood and fed the fire, and Sarah watched the flames dance across his weathered face, casting it half in shadow, half in golden light. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah realized something surprising was happening between them. Trust, perhaps. Or at least the beginning of something that resembled it. Jack would leave her alone for hours, trusting she would not run into the wilderness. Sarah would prepare meals, trusting that Jack valued her presence enough to return each evening. Small trust, but trust nonetheless. One morning, she asked him about his family, about the photographs on the mantel. He went very still, and she thought he might refuse to answer. But instead, he opened a door that had been closed for 15 years. Jack sat across from Sarah as snow began to fall outside the cabin windows. The first snow of the season arrived early that year, blanketing the mountains in white and making the cabin feel even more isolated from the world beyond. Sarah had asked about the photographs, and she had expected him to deflect or dismiss the question. Instead, he seemed almost relieved by the opportunity to speak. "My wife died," he said without preamble. 20 years ago this December. Our daughter was 3 years old. They went to town for supplies on a day like this. The weather changed quickly. I was working on the ranch, about 30 miles from where we lived. By the time I realized a storm was coming, they were already gone." His voice remained flat, emotionless, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table. "I found them in the canyon 2 weeks later. I had searched every day, every night, until I could no longer see. The investigation said the horse stumbled. The wagon went over the edge. They died instantly, or so the preacher told me, as though that should bring comfort." He paused, his eyes distant, fixed on something Sarah could not see. "I buried them on the hillside behind the house where we lived. I stayed there for a year, unable to leave, unable to do anything but visit their graves every morning and every evening." Sarah reached across the table instinctively but stopped before touching him, uncertain if contact would be welcome or unwelcome. Jack continued as if he had not noticed the aborted gesture. "Eventually, I couldn't bear being around people who offered condolences and sympathy. Every expression of pity was another knife. Every person who tried to comfort me was reminding me that my family was gone. So I left. I came to this mountain and decided I would never again allow anyone to matter to me. I would never again place another person's safety ahead of my own survival. I cut myself off from everyone, and for 15 years, I was safe. I was numb. I was alone." He finally looked at Sarah, and the intensity in his eyes nearly made her gasp. "But you were terrified when you arrived, and something in me recognized that fear. It felt familiar. So I allowed you to enter this place, which I had kept locked against all human connection." Sarah found her voice with difficulty. I'm not them, Jack. I can't replace them. I know, he said, and something in his tone suggested he had made peace with this reality long ago. I don't want you to replace them. I could never want that. But I'm beginning to understand that loneliness isn't protection. It's just another kind of death. He stood and walked to the window, watching the snow accumulate on the glass. You asked about my daughter. Her name was Emma. She had your eyes, actually. Brown eyes that could shift from warm to troubled depending on her mood. She wasn't even 4 years old yet, but already she had learned to read people, to sense when something was wrong. She would have liked you. Over the following weeks, Jack shared more pieces of his story. Sarah learned that his wife had been a teacher, passionate about education and believing that even children in remote areas deserved access to knowledge. She had wanted to start a school in their town. Emma had been her mother's daughter, full of questions and wonder about how the world worked. Jack had loved them with the kind of fierce intensity that had been shattered on a canyon floor, leaving him broken and unrepairable. But something shifted in the cabin during those dark winter months. Jack began to talk not just about his past but about the present. He asked Sarah questions about her life, her thoughts, her dreams. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was young, leaving her with a father who grew increasingly withdrawn and controlling after his wife's passing. She explained how she had read every book in the ranch library multiple times, how she had invented entire worlds in her imagination to escape the confines of her limited existence. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jack reached over and took Sarah's hand. It was the first time he had deliberately touched her since the wedding. His palm was rough, calloused from years of manual labor, but his grip was gentle. I'm afraid, he admitted, of letting someone matter again. Of caring about another person. Because care is just another word for risk, and risk means the possibility of losing everything. Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding that this confession cost him more than any physical act could have. I'm afraid too, she whispered. But I think maybe courage isn't the absence of fear. Maybe it's doing things anyway, despite the fear. Jack turned to face her fully, and in the firelight, Sarah saw the man he might have been before tragedy rewrote his story. She saw beneath the hardness to the capacity for tenderness that loss had buried but not extinguished. Whatever happened next would change them both forever. Winter deepened around the cabin with relentless force. Snow accumulated in drifts against the windows, and the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the interior walls in intricate patterns that looked like frozen ferns. The cabin became their entire world, a small bubble of light and warmth surrounded by an unforgiving wilderness. Sarah had now lived there for 3 months, and the separation from her former life felt both distant and impossible. She had stopped thinking of this place as temporary. She had stopped waiting for rescue or escape. Gradually, without defining the moment when it happened, she had begun to think of the cabin as home. Jack had become less of a stranger and more of a puzzle she was slowly learning to piece together, each conversation revealing another layer beneath the weathered exterior. One night, after they had finished dinner and cleared the dishes, Jack took Sarah's hand and led her to the window. Outside, the moon was full and bright, illuminating the snow-covered landscape with silver-white light. The beauty was almost unbearable, too perfect to be real, like looking at a painting of paradise. I want you to know something, Jack said quietly. These past months with you, they've changed me. I didn't expect that. I didn't think I was capable of changing anymore. But you've shown me that the world isn't divided into 2 states, safe and dangerous. You've shown me that there's something in between. Something called living. He turned to face her, and Sarah could see emotion moving beneath his carefully constructed calm. I care about you, Sarah. I don't know how to say this in the way you probably deserve, but I need you to hear it. I'm not the same man I was when you arrived. You've done that. You did that with your kindness and your willingness to see past my walls. Sarah's heart raced in her chest. She had been waiting for something, though she had not consciously known what. She had been waiting for him to say what she had begun to feel herself. Over the months of working together, of sharing meals and conversations and the intimate details of their separate pasts, something had bloomed between them. It wasn't the wild, passionate love described in the novels she had read during her lonely years at the ranch. It was steadier than that, deeper somehow, built on genuine knowledge of another person. I feel it too, she said. But Jack, I'm afraid. You say you care about me, but I haven't, I don't know, she faltered, her cheeks burning. At 23 years old, she was still ignorant of the physical aspects of marriage. Her father had raised her in near total isolation from such knowledge, and the wedding night had passed with no physical intimacy, both of them too raw and uncertain for anything beyond talking until dawn. Jack's expression softened with understanding. He took both her hands in his. "I know you're afraid. But you don't have to be. Not with me." He led her to his bedroom, and in the shadows and candlelight, he showed her what it meant to be wanted, truly wanted, by another person. He moved slowly, carefully, asking permission for each step. He was patient in a way she had not known men could be. He seemed focused entirely on her comfort, her pleasure, her sense of safety. Afterward, lying in his arms as the candles burned low, Sarah understood something fundamental about herself. She understood that courage was not the absence of fear but the willingness to trust someone despite the possibility of being hurt. She understood that love wasn't about passion igniting instantly but about walls gradually coming down between two people. She understood that the woman she had been 3 months ago, afraid, sheltered, uncertain, was gone forever. This woman, this new Sarah, had chosen to be brave. "I love you," she said into the darkness, hardly believing the words were coming from her own mouth. For a long moment, Jack did not respond, and she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Then he kissed the top of her head, and his voice, when he spoke, was thick with emotion. "I love you too. God help me, I do. And I'm terrified of what that means, but I'm more terrified of going back to the way I was before you." Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, and snow continued to fall. But inside, Sarah had never felt warmer, never felt more completely safe. For the first time, she understood that the isolation she had feared was actually the greatest gift Jack had given her. It meant that in this small cabin, high in the mountains, there was no one and nothing but the two of them and the love they had discovered in the ruins of their separate loneliness. Spring came to the mountains with almost violent suddenness. One day, snow covered everything in pristine white. 3 weeks later, flowers burst from the ground in explosions of color: purple lupine, white columbine, golden alpine sunflowers. The world transformed, and with it, something shifted in Jack's demeanor. He became restless, moving between the cabin and the surrounding land with a kind of nervous energy Sarah had not seen before. One morning, he asked her to sit with him on the porch. The entire valley spread before them, green and alive and impossibly beautiful. Jack took her hand and looked at her with an expression that contained both hope and fear. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. "And I realize that I'm asking you to spend your life in isolation, the way I have. I'm asking you to be cut off from the world, and I'm not sure that's fair to you. You're young, Sarah. You deserve to have choices, to experience life beyond these mountains." He paused, struggling with the words. "I'm wondering if you felt trapped. If you've regretted your choice to stay with me." Sarah felt tears rising, though she could not immediately identify whether they were tears of sadness or relief or something more complex. She turned to face him fully. "4 years before I came here, I was physically present in my father's house but emotionally trapped. I was safe but suffocating. Now I'm in a cabin in the wilderness, and I have never felt more free." She reached up and touched his face, stroking the rough stubble of his jaw. "I don't want to leave here. I don't want to go back to civilization or to my father or to the life I had before. But I understand why you're asking." Jack caught her hand and held it against his chest, and Sarah could feel his heart racing beneath her palm. "I've been thinking about something else too," he continued. "There's a small town about 20 miles north of here. Nothing like the cities you might be imagining, but a real community with real people. My wife and I used to visit sometimes, before. They have a school there. An old school building that's been closed for 5 years because no one wanted to teach in such a remote area." He watched her carefully, gauging her reaction. "I was thinking we could move there. That you could teach if you wanted to. That we could be part of a community instead of hiding from the world." The offer stunned her. It represented such a dramatic change from the man who had lived in isolation for 15 years, the man who had told her that isolation was protection. "You would leave this?" she asked, gesturing to the cabin and the wild beauty surrounding them. "For you?" "Yes," Jack said simply. "The cabin was where I came to die. It was my tomb, and I was content to spend the rest of my life here, comfortable in my grief. But you brought life back into these walls. And now I'm beginning to wonder what else is possible. What kind of life we could build if I'm willing to stop running from the world." They made the journey to the town of Copper Creek the following week, driving Jack's wagon down the mountain road that had brought Sarah to her new life 3 years ago. As they approached the town, a small collection of buildings arranged around a central square, Sarah felt the complexity of her emotions like a physical weight. Here was the world again. Here was society and expectation and the possibility of judgment. But Jack held her hand through it all, and his touch grounded her, reminding her that she was not alone. The school building stood on the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with large windows and a bell tower on the roof. The townspeople, initially wary of Jack the Hermit, warmed considerably when he explained that his wife was educated and willing to teach. Within a month, they had renovated the school, repaired the desks, and organized a small library of books from donations. Sarah stood in that classroom on the first day of school and taught 5 children of varying ages about history and literature and mathematics. She was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Meanwhile, Jack began taking on work in the community, helping with repairs and construction. He was not naturally social, and he would never be completely comfortable among crowds. But he attended church social hours with Sarah, and he spoke to people in the town square, and he slowly, gradually, began to rejoin the human world. 1 year after they had moved to Copper Creek, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. When she told Jack, he went very still, and for a moment, Sarah wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Then tears began sliding down his weathered face, and he pulled her close. "I thought I would never allow myself to love another child," he admitted. "I thought that part of me had died with Emma. But I can feel it already, Sarah. I can feel myself loving this child we're going to have, and the thought terrifies me because I know what it means. It means being vulnerable again. It means caring about someone so completely that their safety becomes my entire world." Sarah rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. "That's what love is," she whispered. "It's choosing to be vulnerable. It's trusting that the risk of caring is worth more than the safety of indifference." Their daughter was born in the early spring, 3 years after Sarah had arrived at the cabin as a frightened, isolated girl. They named her Emma, not as a replacement for Jack's lost daughter but as a bridge between his past and his present, between the man who had been broken and the man he had chosen to become. Emma had her mother's eyes and her father's fierce determination, and from her very first moment, she was loved with a completeness that had once seemed impossible. In the years that followed, Sarah and Jack's story became something of a legend in Copper Creek. The young bride and the lonely cowboy who had found each other in the wilderness and somehow managed to transform each other, to learn that isolation wasn't protection and that love wasn't something to fear but something to embrace with open arms. Sarah continued to teach, eventually expanding the school to accept boarding students from surrounding ranches. Jack became involved in the community, respected for his quiet strength and his willingness to help anyone who asked. The cabin in the mountains stood empty eventually, though they never sold it. It remained their secret refuge, a place they could return to when they needed to remember how far they had come, how a terrified virgin bride and a lonely cowboy had managed to build something real from nothing but willingness and trust and the courage to love despite the cost. And on quiet evenings, sitting on the porch of their house in Copper Creek, watching their daughter play in the yard, Jack would turn to Sarah and smile, a real smile, not the careful expression of a man learning to be human again, but the genuine smile of a man who had discovered that life was infinitely richer with someone to share it with. Sarah would squeeze his hand, and in that simple gesture, they would acknowledge the truth they both knew. That sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with excitement and passion but with two people choosing, day after day, to stay. The end.